Welcome to the deep dive. You guys sent in some really fascinating sources about Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II.
Yeah,
It seems like you're really interested in how their personal relationship shaped the Allied war effort.
definitely.
So we'll be exploring that from the dark days of the Blitz all the way to the triumph of D-Day.
Sounds good.
I think it's really interesting that this partnership really kicks off in May 1940.
Yeah.
Hitler's blitzkrieg is just ripping through Europe, and Churchill's just become prime minister.
Yeah. It's a pretty dire situation for Britain.
Talk about trial by fire, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not only does he have to rally a nation facing what seems like impossible odds,
Right.
he also has to convince America, who at the time was very hesitant to get involved, to join the fight.
Yeah, you're right. America was not exactly eager to jump into another war.
Right.
I mean, they were still recovering from the Great Depression.
Of course.
Memories of World War I were still fresh, and there was a strong isolationist sentiment that was running through the country.
So they didn't want to get entangled in another European conflict.
They really didn't. Churchill knew he had an uphill battle to fight.
Absolutely. So he needed American resources,
Yes,
their industrial power, and eventually their manpower.
exactly. His challenge was to make Americans understand that this wasn't just some far-off European squabble.
Right.
He had to convince them that this was a fight for the survival of freedom itself.
Yeah, for sure. So while he's working on winning over America, he's got this other very real and terrifying threat to deal with: the Blitz.
Yeah.
We often hear about the almost legendary stoicism of the British during those air raids.
Right.
But Dan Snow's account kind of paints a more complex picture, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes.
While there was definitely that keep calm and carry on spirit,
Yeah.
the relentless bombing brought about all sorts of tensions.
No, really.
Yeah, crime rates went up and traditional social norms started to loosen.
Wow, it really makes you think about the impact beyond just, the immediate physical destruction. Snow also points out something surprising about the Battle of Britain itself,
Okay.
that the British actually had a technological advantage.
That's right. You see, despite the popular image of this David versus Goliath struggle, the British had radar,
Huh.
which meant they could anticipate German attacks
Wow.
and position their fighter planes much more effectively.
That's a game changer.
Huge. And there's another advantage that's often overlooked. They were fighting on home turf.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah, this meant down dur. British pilots could often get back into the fight pretty quickly, while German pilots, if they were shot down,
Yeah.
ended up as prisoners of war.
It sounds like those details completely changed the narrative of that battle.
They really do. It wasn't just sheer grit that won the day for the British. It was a combination of strategic thinking and leveraging their advantages.
And speaking of strategy, let's talk about Churchill's visit to the White House in December of 1941.
Okay?
It seems pretty clear from our sources that he knew personal diplomacy was going to be crucial to securing America's support. It was a total charm offensive, wasn't it?
Churchill was a master of understanding power dynamics and how to work a room.
Right.
He knew that building a strong personal connection with Roosevelt was vital to persuading him that Britain was an ally worth backing.
I really went all out to make a good impression.
He did.
The book, The Hidden History of the White House, has some really colorful anecdotes.
Oh, yeah.
There's Churchill chauffeuring FDR around in his wheelchair, a story about a possible staged naked encounter,
Oh, wow.
and even tales of Churchill's rather lavish tastes like pre-breakfast sherry and these fancy meals, while wartime rationing was in full swing back in Britain.
You have to admire his boldness, don't you? It was a calculated move.
Yeah.
I mean, those stories may seem like amusing side notes, but they illustrate Churchill's knack for using his personality to his advantage.
But beyond the theatrics, what actually came out of this visit?
Well, this visit resulted in a pivotal shift in American policy. Churchill managed to secure Roosevelt's commitment that the U.S. would prioritize the fight against Germany over the war in the Pacific.
Wow.
This was a huge win for Churchill, who saw Nazi Germany as the most immediate and existential threat.
Yeah.
They also agreed on a unified command structure for the Allied forces, which turned out to be essential for coordinating the war effort.
So this visit wasn't just about warm feelings and handshakes. It had a tangible impact on the direction of the war.
Absolutely.
Now we can't talk about Churchill and Roosevelt without talking about D-Day, which of course was a major turning point in the war in Europe. It involved incredible coordination between the two leaders and was just a monumental undertaking.
It was a colossal operation, the largest amphibious invasion in history.
Yeah.
But here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
D-Day actually wasn't Churchill's first choice.
Really?
Yeah.
But he was so determined to defeat Hitler. Why the hesitation?
Well, you have to remember that Churchill had first-hand experience with the horrors of trench warfare from World War I.
Right.
He was deeply reluctant to commit British troops to another massive land campaign in Europe, especially one that could potentially lead to devastating losses. He actually favored some alternative strategies. Churchill, you see, was a brilliant strategist, and he saw World War II in a much broader context.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was already worried about the growing power of the Soviet Union in the East and what the balance of power in Europe would look like after the war ended.
I see.
So he wasn't just focused on defeating Hitler. He was thinking several steps ahead.
So it sounds like he had some ulterior motives beyond just winning the war.
You could say that. He wanted to make sure that Western Europe would be strong enough to stand up to the Soviet Union after the war.
Okay.
He envisioned a D-Day that would liberate Western Europe, but also limit Soviet influence.
And how did that vision clash with the American approach?
Well, the Americans were primarily focused on the immediate goal of crushing Nazi Germany.
Right.
They weren't as concerned with the finer points of post-war political maneuvering.
I see.
Their priority was a direct assault on Germany, full steam ahead.
So even though they ultimately agreed on D-Day, it seems there were some underlying tensions about the bigger picture, especially as the war went on, and victory seemed more and more likely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There were disagreements over things like resource allocation,
Okay.
the timing of offensives, and the overall strategic direction of the war.
Like what?
Well, for example, Churchill was really insistent on pursuing a campaign in the Balkans,
Okay.
which he saw as a way to block Soviet advances. But the Americans just weren't on board with that.
They weren't.
Nope, they wanted to focus on Germany itself.
It's interesting to see how, even in this incredibly close partnership, those different perspectives and national interests would sometimes create friction.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even in the strongest alliances, there will always be some level of disagreement.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially when you're talking about two nations with different histories,
Right.
cultures, and priorities.
Right.
It's actually pretty remarkable that they managed to achieve the level of cooperation they did, given the immense pressure they were under.
Yeah, their ability to collaborate and ultimately achieve victory despite those tensions speaks volumes about their leadership and the strength of their bond.
Absolutely.
Okay, so their relationship wasn't all smooth sailing, but what about the impact they had on the world after the war? How did their partnership shape the post-war order?
Their legacy is profound. The alliance between Churchill and Roosevelt really laid the foundation for the transatlantic partnership we see today.
Oh, wow.
Think about institutions like NATO,
Right.
the United Nations, the Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
All of these emerged from that shared wartime experience
Yeah.
and a commitment to building a more stable and prosperous world.
So their personal bond, their collaboration, actually helped to reshape the global landscape in a very real way.
For sure.
It wasn't just about winning the war, it was about building a better future.
Exactly. They showed the world that even when faced with unimaginable challenges, nations can work together and achieve extraordinary things. And that's a powerful message that still resonates today, especially as we face new global threats and uncertainties.
It's a testament to the idea that strong leadership and collaboration can overcome even the most daunting obstacles.
I agree.
But what about their personal relationship once the war ended?
Yeah.
Did they stay as close?
Well, the Inita War brought new challenges and priorities.
I bet.
They both had to deal with domestic pressures and a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape.
You're right.
Their personal correspondence continued, but the intensity of their wartime bond inevitably faded.
It makes sense in a way. The war itself had been such a powerful unifying force.
Right.
They were united against a common enemy facing constant threats. That kind of shared experience creates a very particular type of bond.
You're right. It's almost as if the war had been the glue holding their relationship together so closely. With the war over, their paths naturally diverged. They each had their own national stages to return to.
Their story makes you wonder, could such a close bond ever be forged between world leaders in today's world? I mean, things are so different now.
That's a question worth exploring.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we'll do in part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll examine the challenges and opportunities for personal diplomacy in the 21st century and consider whether the Churchill-Roosevelt model offers any valuable lessons for modern statecraft.
Okay, so we're back for this final part of our deep dive into the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship.
Yeah.
We've really seen how their bond influenced the course of World War II. But, it makes you wonder,
What's that?
could that kind of deep personal connection between world leaders even be possible in the 21st century?
It's a good question. The world today is all about instant communication. Summits and these really carefully orchestrated diplomatic events.
Right.
It seems like leaders are constantly in the spotlight,
Yeah.
with every single move they make scrutinized and analyzed.
It does seem like a different world from, those late night strategy sessions
Hmm.
and impromptu wheelchair rides we were talking about earlier.
Yeah,
You're saying there's less room for those unscripted moments
definitely.
that could actually lead to some genuine connection.
Exactly. The whole nature of diplomacy has shifted.
Hmm.
There's just not much space for spontaneity anymore, for those off-the-cuff interactions that can build real trust and rapport.
But hasn't technology also opened up new ways for leaders to connect?
Sure.
I mean, they can video chat, text, even share memes with each other.
Yeah.
Couldn't those types of interactions actually lead to stronger relationships?
Well, that's true. But even with all those tools, you often miss out on the nuances of face-to-face interaction.
I see.
It's just harder to build real trust when you're not physically present,
Yeah.
sharing a meal
Right.
or picking up on those subtle cues from someone's body language.
So are you saying that close personal relationships between world leaders are a thing of the past?
Well, not necessarily. While the challenges are definitely greater in today's world, I think the potential payoff is also huge.
How so?
Well, think about the global issues that we're facing right now.
Like what?
Climate change,
Yeah.
pandemics, economic instability. To tackle these challenges effectively,
Yeah.
we need strong personal relationships between leaders who can work together, not just negotiate at a distance.
So you're saying if they had that kind of trust where they could just pick up the phone
Exactly.
and have a candid, off-the-record conversation during a crisis,
Yes.
that they could look beyond their own national interests and actually work together to find solutions.
Precisely. That's the kind of dynamic that can make all the difference. But how do we foster that in today's, hyper-connected, hyper-scrutinized world?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
It is.
It seems like it would require a real commitment from leaders to prioritize personal diplomacy,
I think so.
to make time for those informal interactions,
Yeah.
to go beyond the usual diplomatic protocols.
It's about creating space for those moments of genuine human connection.
Yeah.
The kind of connection that can transcend national boundaries and lead to real collaboration. We need to remember that diplomacy isn't just about policies and treaties. It's about people.
That makes me think back to Churchill and Roosevelt. Their bond wasn't just about, shared interests or strategic goals.
Right.
It was about a shared sense of purpose, a deep respect for each other. They were willing to kind of set their egos aside
Yeah,
for the greater good.
absolutely. And that's a powerful lesson for us today. They understood that personal relationships can be a force for positive change in the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship, I think you've given us a lot to consider. Here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder.
Yeah.
In this world where technology seems to rule everything, is there still room for leaders who can forge those kinds of deep personal connections? And if so, what kind of impact could that have on our collective future? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.